Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Aspen Institute Business and Society program. In today's webinar, Going Beyond ESG Scores, Putting Purpose at the Heart of Corporate Decision-Making. I'm pleased to be with you today. My name is Judy Samuelson, and I lead the Business and Society program for the Aspen Institute. This conversation today is really the closing event in a program we've been hosting over the last week, which we call the Art of the ESG Conversation. This event is now in its fourth year, and we host it in order to try to help make sense out of this kind of frenzy of interest taking place in ESG, environment, social, and governance. To define it a bit more, and to maybe work to improve the conversations that are taking place between companies and investors on the one hand, but also within companies and with other constituents and stakeholders. Today's conversation focuses on the executive and the board. And we have two gentlemen with us who work deeply in this domain. Brandon Nelson is the general counsel and corporate secretary for JetBlue. We're going to learn a little bit more about him from Brandon in just a minute. And Joe Wolk is with Johnson & Johnson, where he is CFO and has been with the company for over 20 years, close to 23 years in financial functions. Brandon has been at JetBlue for 15 years. For both of these gentlemen have been at their organizations for a long period of time and understand the transitions that have taken place in these last years. Today's conversation is going to go into the executive and the board, but also kind of talk a bit more about this call to go beyond the numbers. Think more about the language and the metrics and the kind of language of environmental and social impact that's shaping corporate decision-making. So it's helpful to have two different industries represented and two in some respects that have both been deeply affected by this public health crisis that is that we're moving through now and reaching a different phase. And of course, it's rebounding both within J&J and JetBlue. So I thought I would start out by having Brandon and Joe introduce themselves and maybe just say a word about their jobs in the context of the last year and what they've been weathering, a little bit about their companies and what the experience has been for them in these critical professional roles where they sit between the executive and the board in this moment. Brandon, can we start by having you introduce yourself a bit?
Sure. Thank you, Judy, and thanks to the Aspen Institute for having me on the Business and Society panel. So I've been with JetBlue, as Judy noted, since 2005. I currently serve in the role of general counsel and corporate secretary. So the corporate secretary piece, I'm the corporate secretary to the board. So I'm sort of the liaison between the leadership team and the board. And I sit in on many of our committee meetings as well as all board meetings, which is relevant to this conversation. As part of my general counsel duties, I also lead our ESG function, what we really call our sustainability and ESG practice, cyber and IT security. And so I have a perspective on all of those things. What has the last year been like? It's been intense. Our business has been impacted probably in a different way than Joe's, although I thank Johnson & Johnson for all the great work they're doing in leading us out of this. There is light at the tunnel as well as some of their competitors. But the impact in 2020 was devastating. When we look back to April and May, you had demand down 95% year over year. So our business essentially grinded to a halt. Now we have recovered from that low point, but year over year, we're still down, more than 50% of where we would be in a so-called normal year. So significant impact on demand. What does that mean? It means we've had to raise a lot of money. So we've tapped the public capital markets. We've also had to adjust our operation to ensure a focus on safety. And we've really had to strike a balance between ensuring the longevity of the business and being mindful of the fear and emotion that is running through a lot of the public around traveling and safety and navigating this COVID world. So it's been the most difficult year, certainly for our company's history, and I think the history of the industry as well. And then if you layer on top of that all of the events that we've seen around the societal movements, and so that's the S part of the ESG. So that's also come into play. So a very complicated year, but I think it's provided an opportunity to really define, as Judy noted, what we mean by ESG. So I'll just
Well, great.
provide those comments as an opening and turn it back over to
Excellent.
you, Judy.
Thank you so much. We'll come back to you. Joe, please introduce yourself a bit and tell us a bit about your year.
Great. So thank you, Judy, for having me, as well as to the Aspen Institute. And certainly is a pleasure to be here with you and Brandon today. As you mentioned, been with Johnson & Johnson for better than 20 years now, going on 23, joined in 1998. We were a large company then. We're even larger now, supplying, solutions to health challenges across the globe. And I think that's really a nice segue into what has 2020 meant. J&J's really taken the opportunity, like Brandon, our business was impacted as well, as you can imagine, with many of the restrictive measures that were put in place, appropriately so. But we relied on our expertise, our commitment to society for changing the trajectory of human health, to come up with what will hopefully be some very novel solutions here in the form primarily of a vaccine. But to think that our employees really across the globe continued their persistence, their diligence, and their efforts to ensure that we provided important life-saving, life-enhancing medicines and surgical instruments to make sure that there wasn't a disruption to those supply chains was critically important this year. And so we kind of lived into what our CEO has phrased as we were built for times like this. And it really has become somewhat of a rallying cry. And it does speak a lot, I believe, to some of the very pronounced concepts within ESG. So looking forward to discussing that further with you here today, Judy.
Great. Thank you again for both being here. So let's just jump into the term. I struggle with it, frankly. I find it flat. And sometimes I don't know what the G part really is about. Like, what are we really measuring when it comes to governance? And yet governance is more important than anything else, how we go about making decisions. Hard to measure. But can you talk a bit? It means something different to different constituents. It's a term of art that I think grew up around the desire of investors to be able to try to categorize what they were trying to measure differently in the non-financial domain. But can you talk about what this term has come to mean from where you sit? Is it taken on different attributes depending on who you talk to? Like, how do you think about it? How do you define it? And then maybe we can get back to this year, but this is a term that's been growing in usage and interest for well over a decade now. Brandon, should we start with you?
Sure. The way we look at ESG is it's essentially a framework for analyzing and mitigating risk to the business. That's how it started. Most of those risks were external. That's sort of the E piece, the S, societal trends, and the G, how do you put a framework around it? When we talk about governance, we think about metrics. How is the board engaged? How's the leadership team engaged? How are you reporting? That was certainly important from an investor standpoint. And it's now evolved. So it's now not just about risk and medium and long-term risk, but it's also about opportunities. And that time frame, I think, has moved closer. So it's short to medium term, both risk and opportunities. And you think, again, the S this year, these societal trends, how do you respond to employees, crew members, as we call them? How do you respond to changing demographics of your customer base, of society in general? How will that impact the product or service that you're offering, and what steps are you doing to mitigate that? If you look at our business, the E is critically important. We fly airplanes that generally use Jet A fuel, which is a fossil fuel. So we have an emissions footprint. And how do we mitigate that going forward? If you look at sort of the flight shaming movement that's happened across Europe, is that coming to the United States? That's a trend that we see externally. And so ESG provides a framework for us to think about how do we mitigate those trends.
Joe, how about you? How do you use the term internally at J&J?
Yeah, well, Judy, first off, I'm somewhat relieved that even you're a little bit perplexed as to how should it be applied, because we do hear it in so many different contexts these days. You know, I think as I think about it with Johnson & Johnson, so as the world's largest healthcare company, we are fortunate to be uniquely positioned to not only apply our expertise, but to partner with so many different aspects of the globe to really power up our capabilities and solve some of those most difficult global health challenges. We focus really our sustainability efforts where we believe our company can achieve the greatest impact. I think that's critically important to ensuring that when we have success, it's as impactful in a favorable way as it can be. You know, these efforts are based on, I would say, our ESG priorities, which are certainly informed by our company's purpose to, again, change the trajectory of health for humanity. And I think, you know, as I reflect, there's many reasons why there is a growth in the interest of ESG topics, and I think it's healthy conversation. So if you look at the reasons that I think we've seen is that it's the contextualized disclosure, right? So it's good to have a narrative, but now we're starting to evolve that conversation to how do you back that up with data that affords, you know, stakeholders the opportunity to learn and perhaps even critique how a company's results are achieved to better understand the sustainability of the company's business model. You know, I think about it in terms of, you know, having sound environmental, social and governance practices are highly correlated to, I think, financial value creation by building stakeholder trust and driving innovation, mitigating risk, fostering employee engagement. We're seeing that certainly on the rise in terms of the workforce and how we're able to recruit. Folks want to work for a company that has a purpose and a mission. And many times, sound ESG actually results in reduced cost, which is often overlooked. I think there's a perception that if we are applying diligent ESG, that somehow that translates to higher cost. I've always found it in my line of work that it often results in improved cost structures. So, you know,
can you give an example of that?
Sure. I remember going back, 6 years ago, we had a little bit of a good year going, and we created an innovation fund for our management team and solicited from the employee base, hey, what ideas do you have where we can invest some of this upside to further the business? So we didn't couch it in terms of ESG. And there was a biologic product that probably came in I want to say a 3 foot by 3 foot carton, had a lot of styrofoam. One of the teams came up with a very innovative, I think it was a 12-inch by 12-inch package that was able to maintain the properties of that biological product, was a much smaller footprint in terms of environmental concerns, and it was much cheaper to do. And you look at those types of things where you just say, boy, that's a win across the board and everybody benefits. And again, I think that also speaks to that employee engagement, where if people feel they have a difference and they can align their values to what they're doing, quite frankly, more often than anything else they do in their lives, that's a pretty good equation, I think, for having a strong workforce and having a vibrant company.
So let's talk a little bit more about decision making in the executive suite. Brandon, you gave the example of kind of flight shaming as one kind of hot issue that I assume creates at least a conversation in the executive and maybe in the board. What's actually changed as a result of the kind of cacophony of voices asking for measurements, and we know what the impact has been on the CSO, on the Chief Sustainability Officer, in terms of the demands of trying to figure out who do they respond to, how do they do this in a way that's efficient, how do they tell their story when they're stuck behind kind of generic metrics? Is it really, how do they balance the storytelling of helping people understand the narrative that is important to kind of enhancing both your brand and to kind of help lead your employees, but at the same time responding. Like, what is this? Is it starting to settle out? Are you starting to see ways in which it's actually affecting decision making, or is it mostly down in the CSO's office and not so much in the executive? Can you talk
Yeah,
about this?
sure. So what's actually changed? I'll take that, but I will start at, from our perspective and our program, we've been at this for a while, sustainability and ESG. So we've always had a very highly engaged leadership and board on this topic. That's even more so the case now. So from a board perspective, I will tell you, we set up, the board set up an ESG subcommittee. So it's a subcommittee of governance and nominating. That happened this year. The presentations to the board are more frequent around our program. What are we doing? Setting specific metrics. So the governance piece from a board perspective is significantly more involved. The questions they're asking are not just around the program, but they're asking, my peer, our CFO, well, how's it funded? What's the CFO perspective on this? So it's great that you have all of these great initiatives, but how are they funded? How does that cycle through the budgeting process? Where exactly do the dollars show up? From a leadership perspective, one of the things that's changed, we have business cases like many organizations, and as part of putting together a business case, you go through, what are the OpEx requirements? What are the CapEx requirements? How does it impact operationally, adding an ESG lens through that process. So embedding it into decision making, to use your phrase, through the tools that are currently available. And on the last piece on reporting, it's not just enough to have that compelling narrative, which we've had, many other companies had, but from a real investor and governance perspective, putting out specific targets and initiatives. That has changed in 2020. So it's not just enough to say we're committed to DEI, or we want to commit by 2050 to reduce our emissions by 15%. Those sort of long-term commitments that aren't easily sort of measured in the short term, that has changed significantly as well.
I'd love to come back to the board, how that decision was made and how that's working out for you. But let me turn for a minute back to Joe. Joe, obviously Johnson & Johnson, Credo, tell me the year. You probably know the year.
1943.
1943, wow. So anybody who followed the Business Roundtable statement and track that with the language of the Credo, we know that these are pretty closely aligned with one another. And of course, Alex Gorski, your CEO, was heavily involved in that decision and the framing of the kind of restatement of the purpose of the corporation that took place at the BRT a year ago. But tell us, what's changed? I mean, we understand that J&J has a strong culture and that the Credo has been a part of the operation and is a kind of an organizing principle for the culture. But has anything changed? You're already there? Like, what are you feeling from the inside in your role as CFO?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think Brandon touched upon a number of things that have changed in either the most recent year or in recent years in terms of measurement, making sure that we're linking some of these investments that we're making to our business, whether it be strategically or through a lens of financial health. So I would say, Judy, that we're fortunate. The leadership team at Johnson & Johnson right now is very fortunate for the work that our predecessors did in instituting a mindset around the Credo, which, as you note, is very, very close to what the Business Roundtable came out with. And for those maybe on today's call that aren't familiar with it, it really speaks to, it's a 4-paragraph document. It speaks to serving our customers, which includes patients, physicians, nurses, mothers and fathers. Second paragraph addresses employee well-being and all that encompasses. Third paragraph addresses environment and the communities in which we work and live. And then the fourth paragraph is the shareholders and ensuring that they receive a fair return. Now, many people approach me as the CFO, as you can imagine, say, well, clearly
That's
the
fair.
shareholders are last, so that that's the least priority. What I point out to folks is that the word must appears in that document more than 20 times. And to me, it's such a great and powerful word. It's really unequivocal, right? It doesn't leave it to chance or, hey, maybe we'll get to it. It really encumbers upon management as well as the broader company a number of responsibilities that sometimes creates a healthy tension, but over time produces, I think, a very sustainable business that kind of meets all of its stakeholders' needs and requirements. In terms of how we're measuring it, it is part of what the board of directors requires from management. We have a scorecard, as most companies do, and there is a section dedicated to our ESG efforts, just as much as there is for sales and income. And so it is something that there's a growing interest. There's clearly, as you noted at the outset, Judy, a number of opinions and a number of thoughts, but it's all fostering a further dialogue. And again, we're somewhat blessed, I'd say, in that we've got the good fortune of having this credo-based organization that it's kind of an easy fit for us. It doesn't mean it doesn't evolve. We for only the second time in its 77-year history, the words were changed a few, probably about 18 months ago, to include some of today's more novel concepts, more appropriate concepts to make it, a little bit more relevant for the times. But it is something that provides just a tremendous framework by which we make a number of business decisions, not just those around ESG.
So I want to ask you about the concept of a fair return. Does that get discussed?
At the board or the executive committee? Absolutely, it does.
What does it mean?
It means living into the expectations that shareholders have. I think at its fundamental core, it's making sure we ensure the long-term health of our business. So that means investing today. While it's easy to improve earnings per share by potentially a few pennies in the current year, are we serving our employees? Are we serving our patients? Are we serving society better by investing in some novel research that maybe has even a high chance of failure that will deliver benefit, though, in 10 or 15 years' time? It's kind of how we hold ourselves accountable. So having that long-term mindset, I think, dovetails into a fair return. Being the company that we are over time, I think we've tracked pretty much at or above the market indices, but not each and every year. And to me, that's what a fair return means.
So let me ask you one more thing, and then I'll go back to Brendan. So in your job, you talked about the scorecard and that there's a piece of it that's kind of the ESG piece, right? So I guess that these are metrics that may or may not be as financially, some of it may be measured in financial terms, I don't know. But does that fall under your job? Is that part of your responsibility, that part of the scorecard?
It falls across the entire management team. So we have different executives who are responsible for different aspects of it. So if you take some of the diversity and inclusion metrics, that will be spoken to by the head, our CHRO. That doesn't mean that Joe Wolk, as CFO, abdicates any role in that. I'm just as responsible for my peer in HR to come up with those results, and that's how we measure all of our leadership.
I see. So it's kind of across the function. Everybody has to be paying attention to all of the aspects of this. So I have a sense of what your job is, Brandon. The general counsel is often seen as the roadblock on all things ESG. Kind of Mr. No. Is that fair? Has that changed? What's the status now?
Unfair.
Unfair.
I think, not just speaking for myself, I think most general counsels in 2020 understand this space. And as I stated earlier, part of this is a risk mitigation function, which I think is part of where your question comes from, because lawyers tend to be very risk averse. But very much a part of it is understanding the opportunities as well. And even before this pandemic, but certainly after, I think most general counsels, certainly companies of our size or larger, have had to adjust their risk apertures, have had to widen it. So I don't think that's necessarily a fair label for general, sort of modern day general counsels. We just can't afford to do that. The world has moved too quickly, and the positions that we previously, took or have taken historically, aren't sustainable, to use a relevant term, in this environment. So, um,
So let's talk a little bit about kind of how ESG gets integrated into strategy, if we might. We've got some questions that are starting to come in. Thank you. Keep the questions coming, or comments if you wish, and we'll try to weave them in through the last half an hour we have here together. But how do you think about kind of ESG one of the questions that's come in is how ESG is being integrated into organizational strategy? And maybe an example of how that happens would be useful. If you have a way, Brandon, to use this as an opportunity to talk about the role of the board and the committee that's been created, great. But let me stick with you for a minute on this question of ESG as a part of strategy.
Sure, it's deeply embedded. An example, so we're an airline, so we buy aircraft. We have regularly review our fleet, which are significant capital commitments when you're buying aircraft. I mean, the list price for these planes are anywhere from $80 to $100 million each, so very significant commitments. As part of looking at future fleet decisions and refreshments, you look at what are the technological capabilities. So do they have the ability to use or consume sustainable aviation fuel? Are they more fuel efficient? If you look at both Boeing and Airbus, they've put out far more fuel efficient aircraft, mostly through engine technology. You look at our order book of what we call NEOs, or new engine options, and those are up to 15% more fuel efficient. So part of building a business case for fleet decisions, you factor in the emissions reduction that new technologies provide for you. That's certainly one example. When we look at the places in which we fly, we several years ago, we performed what we call kind of an eco earnings analysis. So attempting to establish a correlation between clean beaches, reefs that had either been revitalized or still intact, and revenue. So do you get a premium for flying to places that are cleaner and more sustainable? And if you can establish that connection, how does that factor into how do you build a route network? So fundamentally embedding it into the business. I do want to pick up one last point on what Joe was saying around targets and how we embed those into executive comp. So also embedding that into the exec comp goals of the leadership team, from the CEO to me to others on the team. And so it all gets wrapped in that way. So it's embedded in the strategy. The leadership team's ability and how they're measured on executing against the strategy is also factored into compensation. And that's something, at least for us, that has been more of a focus in 2020 than it was before.
Interesting. How about, and I'm going to come back again to you on the board question, but Joe, give me an example of kind of how the conversation on ESG, take any piece of it. I don't, it's a very broad reach for a company as large as the enterprise. Where has it affected your strategy?
Yeah, I would say, Judy, it's probably better stated that it's become part of our strategic discussion. So it's not necessarily a pillar unto itself to say, okay, well, it's going to be our ESG strategy, and that's going to somehow be independent of our pharmaceutical, medical device, and consumer businesses strategies. And I think that's a very healthy way to look at it. If we focus on our core businesses and then understand when we have to build a new manufacturing plant, what does that look like in terms of environmental impact and footprints? I think in terms of when the talent, if we would have gone back 10 years, just like every other company, we were looking for the best talent. We now have a much better appreciation that diversity of thought, diversity of experience leads to much better business decisions and discourse to come up with better outcomes for the people that we're trying to best serve. I think most pronounced, though, being a healthcare company, a couple things that I can point to as recent examples is, when we talked about what kind of impact are we going to have on society, on inclusion and social justice, we viewed it through the lens of, well, where is our expertise? And as we've come to learn through COVID-19, communities of color had disparate access to health care, and were even being sampled less in clinical trials. Well, there's a great area for Johnson & Johnson to actually have a profound impact. We're uniquely positioned to influence that so that we can create better health outcomes for all ethnicities, quite frankly. We're including that in our vaccine trial study to make sure it's not just getting to the 40,000 patients that suggest that the vaccine's going to be effective, which hopefully we can demonstrate as the data plays out and the science dictates here. We'll find out. But it's also, we'll be able to draw some really firm conclusions about elderly population, Hispanic population, the Black community. And I think that's very important. And then lastly, if we are successful with our scientific efforts around the vaccine, it's making sure that those people who are in developing countries or developing parts of the world who maybe don't have that same level of access, how do we create vaccine regimens that the supply goes to them as well in the allocation? So we're having active discussions with organizations that are on the front line, so to speak, to make sure that those underserved people are also served to prevent and hopefully mitigate the impact of the pandemic itself. So those are some recent examples that J&J has been part of, but I think having it focused in areas where we are uniquely positioned to have an impact, and then delivering on that really works well for us.
Thanks. How many employees at J&J?
135,000.
135,000, and how many countries do you operate in?
Oh boy, that's just about everyone.
Everywhere.
I think.
They're what's not on the list, right?
200, I think. Yeah, 180, I believe, was the last count.
Brandon, how about JetBlue?
Pre-pandemic, we were about 23,000 crew members. We're down a bit from that.
Right.
Although notably, we have not had any furloughs. I think we're the only U.S. airline, potentially the only airline in the world, that has not either furloughed or sent out WARN notices. So we're very proud of that.
Wow.
And we're about 24 to 25 countries. We've had a lot of network changes in the last 6 months. So my number may be off by one or two.
So I want to ask you both about, we have a question that came in about leadership development in this context of thinking about social environmental impacts of decisions. Joe, you talked about a domain that is so critically important, not just access to services, but lifespan is different, between different communities of interest, and it's a domain that you can imagine at a company like J&J would be an interesting organizing principle for how do you think about strategy as well as products and outreach. And so I guess the question I'm asking is, where does this come up for the development of leaders? And that's a question that might be happening in terms of how do you get on one story or integrate these priorities across the broad reach of an enterprise like J&J, but it may also be coming up in the search for talent at the most senior executive levels, or the development of kind of, those who will take over from all of us once we leave. How do you think about that? Brandon, Joe, who would like to start? Go.
I'm happy to start.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, so I did speak about the credo, and when we evaluate leaders, and we're going through that year-end process now, we look at two measures. It's the what, so what were the business results for the year as established at the beginning of the year, and then it's the how, and that's largely correlated to some of the credo behaviors that I outlined earlier, and that happens at every level of the organization. Matter of fact, when I counsel people if they're coming in for an interview to join the organization, I do spend time with them. And I'm not unique at Johnson & Johnson, just explaining to them the credo and what it means and how to reflect prior to the interview as to how they may have lived into that or why they see value in it. So we look at that extremely diligently. It's very, very hard. I would say almost impossible to advance a career if you kind of don't have that blend of both in terms of the what and the how with respect to it. And we do see, as Brandon pointed out with JetBlue, and he calls them crew members, that the engagement of your workforce is critically important to long-term success. And we're finding that more and more people want to work for companies like a Johnson & Johnson, like a JetBlue, that are mission-based. And we think that's a very strong component of why we are successful. I'm not suggesting it's for everyone, but I think it has more appeal than not when we're looking at highly prized talent.
Brandon, talent development, or how do you build this into executive development? Is that something that you have to think about in your responsibilities?
Absolutely. Very, very similar to what Joe described on the how and the what. We have a blue standard. So talking about the how, it tracks to our cultural values that we've established as an organization. So it comes into play in that way. There are other sort of very specific initiatives that we've developed as part of our evolving DEI strategy. So whether that's diverse slates, there's the Rooney Rule, the Mansfield Rule, all sorts of rules out there. But I think the important point to note there, again, it goes back to what's changed in 2020 is having very specific initiatives. So that's on the retention side. On the development, it's establishing whether they're mentor programs or other things to ensure that we are developing talent across the spectrum. One thing that's very unique to us as an airline is we have a very large, what we call frontline crew member base. You asked me about the number, it's 20, call it around 22, 23,000. There's maybe 1,500, 2,000 of us in support roles, so the rest are frontline. So thinking about, and that frontline population is significantly more diverse than we are here. So how do you think about incorporating that population into more support center roles, and specifically having conversations about, higher paying jobs that we have an ability to have more of an influence and impact, and using that current pipeline, which we have, a huge pool of talent of frontline leaders, and incorporating them and developing that pool into these support center roles. So that's something very specific that we've talked about in 2020.
So that's about moving people into different positions as opposed to developing the talent differently. Do I understand that right?
It's both. So if you have a pool of talent internally, how can you develop them in a way that will make them candidates and ultimately successful in roles that potentially have a higher impact and influence value? So bringing you from a frontline role to more of a managerial role in a support function. So if I work in an airport and I'm an AO worker, as we call our AO crew members, are there development opportunities, or are there pipeline opportunities to then come into the support center to have to work with our network team to determine sort of where we fly and how we deploy our assets? So it's both.
So let me, we have a question that did come in about boards, one of my favorite topics. I'm thinking a lot about boards these days for some reason. I think their job is changing maybe. And so I'm kind of curious how you actually think, I don't know if either of you is involved with the actual board selection or recruitment, but you certainly have an opportunity to view boards up close and personal here. So the question that has been asked in our chat is kind of what new questions directors are asking that fall into this kind of domain of conversation about ESG. Are you seeing real interest from boards, or are you anticipating it? What's going on from that vantage point?
Yeah, I'm happy to take the lead on that. We've had a fairly significant refresh of our board. If you look at over the last 2.5 years, we have about 5 new board members, and that's all since I've been in seat. And so having had an opportunity to have a bit of a view into the process, I will say some of it tracks what you're saying from the larger workforce group, which is this concept that Joe mentioned is mission oriented and mission focused. Those questions from candidates tend to appear probably more frequently than they did in the past. From a board and selection process, one of the things that our board looks at, certainly not outcome determinative, but questions around ESG fluency. To what degree are you sort of familiar, not looking necessarily for subject matter expertise. And I think you will probably see more of both of those on the candidate side, more questions around mission, and on the board side, ESG fluency. Certainly as you look at generational changes in board, I think, we've certainly brought in board members who are demographically in a different generation than historical ones. And so I think you'll see more of that as this sort of next generation of board members comes into play.
So Joe, I want to come back to you on this too, but Brandon, talk about this decision to create a committee that had a focus. I don't remember what you call the committee.
It's called the ESG Committee, much to
ESG Committee.
Not surprisingly, okay. And maybe much to your chagrin, but
what's it about? Is it about environment? Is it about governance? What do they really do?
It's about all three. So what do they really do? To underscore, so the board in their own wisdom determined to set this up earlier this year, so kudos to them. What do? They want to ensure, one, that they have a direct insight into the ESG strategy, or more importantly, as Joe put it, how the ESG strategy is embedded into the business. So they want to have a direct line of sight. So the ESG role reports into me, and then I certainly serve the board, so they have that lens, but they also want to ensure that from a committee perspective, it's there so they can report out to the board. They want to know what the metrics and the targets are. They want to know what responsibility the board has in the various committees. So whether it's workforce development, talent management, this developing leadership concept that you raised, does that sit with our compensation committee? Does that sit with the full board? All of those questions they want to ensure that they have insight into, and they ultimately want to know how it's funded and whether there's budget and there's leadership buy-in. And one of the ways they can help inform or make that determination is speaking directly to the teams who lead these functions. And that's part of the purpose of the subcommittee.
It seems like, I don't know that I've heard a board to say we need a different committee. Is that, I don't know that, have you experienced that before?
We have seen, as we did some benchmarking, there are other boards that have similar committees. So whether it's a CSR, ESG type committee, there are other models out there.
No, but I mean that the board is the one that took the initiative.
Well, certainly they took the initiative. They were informed by leadership's view, and we provided that benchmarking and provided sort of an argument for it. But ultimately, it's something that they determined to stand up. But look, they're out in the world on other boards. They have other sources of information. They understand how the world is evolving. They understand that investors are asking these questions. And so, it's push and pull. It's certainly the leadership team can provide a model, but it's ultimately their determination.
It's interesting. I mean, my own personal forecast is we're going to see boards becoming more engaged, but, so I'm looking at this as maybe one example of that. But Joe, over to you. What are you seeing at J&J? What's the role that the board really plays here?
Yeah, so I think Brandon really touched on something there towards the end of his last response with respect to just how experienced and how broad the perspective of board members are on major companies. That our board clearly has recognized evolving business and social pressures that impact our business, because they see it through the lens of many other businesses, as well as leveraging their own expertise. Within our board, we have had for some time on our Science, Technology, and Sustainability Committee, a specific mandate for that team to look at our ESG practices, the overall strategy, and the priorities. So it's a standing item, as I said, on their agenda. And they really look at all the scientific and technological aspects of product safety matters, and also helping the board, other board members understand the emerging science and technology policy. With respect to board additions, I don't have any say in that, but I do know, while it's not quite the overhaul that Brandon outlined, we've had about 4 new board members in the last few years. The board is committed to continually refreshing the composition of the board, seeking candidates who have been, really leaders of large, complex organizations across industry, in medicine, across academia. Really pleased to announce just the appointment last week of Dr. Nadia West to Johnson & Johnson's board. She's a retired U.S. Army lieutenant and former U.S. Army Surgeon General, so just impressive background. And every time I have the chance to interact with any of our board members, it's an enlightening experience. But these are very well-versed people. They're up with the times, and they very much hold us accountable to ensure that we're improving the measures that are in place and investigating new ones that, again, will lead to the long-term sustainable health of our business.
So let me ask you quickly, just one more question on boards. One of the parts of the question around boards was about whether or not you actually have changed anything about what you're providing to boards in terms of ESG kind of information. Has that changed at all in the last couple of years?
Yeah, Judy, some of the, oh, I'm sorry, Brandon.
Go ahead, Joe.
Some of the scorecard activity that I talked about a little bit earlier, that is relatively new, I would say, within the last 2 years, and that continues to get enhanced as topics or items emerge.
Brandon?
Much more detailed information about trends that we're seeing in the market. We've put in place what we call kind of an ESG toolkit that we regularly update, that we provide on our director portal that they can access. There's just so much data and information out there, and this is changing so quickly, certainly around what other companies or airlines are doing in our industry. That's always a relevant point. So just the quality of the data has improved, or the materials that we provide, and certainly the quantity.
This question came from one of those many people in our audience who probably have responsibility for reporting. That is a major undertaking by companies of your scale and reach, and brands, right? Brands are always in the front line of reporting requests. What do you have a preferred format? I mean, do you like, the SDGs, do they matter, like SASB? Do you have is there anything you would offer this audience that is kind of a philosophy of your companies in terms of we respond to absolutely every request we get, or we pick and choose? It's an overwhelming task, frankly.
Yeah, so Judy, I can tell you that at Johnson & Johnson, for the past, I believe it's 4 years now, we've issued a Health for Humanity report. It usually is published in June of each year. And although I'm the CFO, and I really shouldn't say that, it's almost a much more appealing read than our annual report. And again, as a CFO, I probably shouldn't be saying that, but you find out so much about the company and what we're doing on behalf of society, on behalf of our employees. It's because of the outcry that we've heard from the investment community, we've actually now accompanied a webcast to go with the day we distribute that report, just to answer some of the questions that may be on people's mind with respect to how Johnson & Johnson is managing this. And we look to continually evolve that report. It does become kind of the benchmark or the annual report, if you will, about the health of our ESG progress.
And
so
do you
that
think is it directed mostly at people on the outside or at employees?
Boy, I think with any good publication, we're striving for both. We get a lot of great feedback from both internal and external parties. And the internal feedback is, wow, I didn't realize our company did this. Externally, I think it was an effort really to, I think, quell kind of these one-off questions, right, that we were getting in much larger numbers, and it was being disruptive. So why not kind of institutionalize or give some protocol around how we report these metrics? if you ask me about philosophy on these metrics, the one thing that I think is critically important that I hope organizations like SASB keep in mind is, let's make sure there's a business benefit to the metric being measured. Having metrics for metric's sake, I think, can lead to some concerning unintended consequences like administrative burden. And we want to make sure that the information being requested is relevant. It helps leadership run the business a little bit more effectively. And it also helps the outside world gain a better perspective as to what type of investment Johnson & Johnson is and what are they living into in terms of their value system.
So I just want to repeat what you just said, but one of the tests of response is whether or not it's of use to your own management in terms of its decision making. Did I catch that right?
I think that's what I think as we're starting to craft what is going to be the formal reporting, I think having that concept in mind is beneficial. I think of it very much like SEC requirements in GAAP. Most of the metrics that are in those requirements, and I'm not saying 100%, but by and large, if we can develop systems where it's beneficial for Brandon and his leadership team to report on metrics that are relevant to them making better decisions, and the same at Johnson & Johnson or AT&T or wherever you go, I think that leads to a healthier system and one that people are much more willing to engage in.
Very hard to do when they become very generic, I would say. That seems to be one of the challenges. Brandon, over to you. What's your philosophy about all of the demands on you for reporting?
Yeah, I think Joe nailed it. The only thing I would add is we also have a sustainability and ESG report that we put out every year, started going back to 2006, just a sustainability report. Look, I think some level of harmonization would be useful. We report on SASB, TCFD, but ultimately it has to be sort of relevant to the company and the industry. I will say we don't respond to every request, but we like to frame our reporting around what we're hearing from investors, because we certainly engage with our owners pretty frequently. And so we like to think that we're responsive to most of their reasonable requests.
Interesting. So we got a question in here about frontline workers. We haven't talked too much about employees has come up, employee engagement has come up. We're certainly seeing generally in the kind of in this kind of ESG space, one of the members of our own advisory board, Leo Strine, the former chancellor of the Delaware Court and Supreme Court Justice of Delaware, has been arguing that we need to move from ESG to EESG. In other words, employees are not just part of a mashup of people who are affected by kind of social context and the impact of business decisions. I mean, they are a discrete and unquestionably important part of the puzzle today. The way the question came in is, how can frontline or early career employees make a difference in moving the organization toward an ESG and sustainability mindset? So I guess I first ask, are you seeing that? Are you seeing we certainly see it in any number of companies where employees are the ones that have been standing up and kind of been the loudest voice here. So curious what you're seeing from inside and any advice to people who are early in their careers here.
Speak up. We have a very engaged crew member base. Certainly our frontline crew members have historically done that. So for JetBlue crew members, continue to speak up, but for broadly, companies are reacting now in a way that's faster and I think more specific and targeted to what they're hearing from their employee base. So employees have a significantly louder voice at the table, and I mean that in a good way, than they have historically. So expressing to the company and the organization the things that are important, and just to continue to underscore, a lot of that has to do with mission-driven. What's the purpose? Why are we here? What's our ultimate purpose, or what's our ultimate goal as a company? Our mission is to inspire humanity, and that's a really, really broad mission.
Your mission is to inspire humanity?
It started with bringing humanity back to air travel, and we have subsequently shortened it to inspire humanity. And the other thing is hold us accountable to that. So if we're going to go out with such a such a broad and overarching mission, then hold us accountable. So speak up about the things that are important to you as frontline employees, and hold your organizations accountable to to the things that you say you're going to do.
Joe, over to you. What are you seeing from employees?
Yeah, Brandon's spot on there, right? For earlier career employees, speaking up is critical. There's so much that we can learn in many aspects of business, not just ESG, but I think about technology. Reverse mentoring relationships are profoundly valuable, and having folks speak up earlier in their career is something that we want to encourage. I think what we can do as leadership, quite frankly, is to ensure that we've created an atmosphere where there is open dialogue and people are comfortable coming forward. But speaking up is critically important. We'd like to think as a management team, we know all the aspects and what is going to inspire employees and motivate them. And, I like to think we even get it right more often than we get it wrong. But until we hear from the voice of the customer, so to speak, we never really know. Brandon spoke a little bit about getting employee feedback in one of his previous responses. We do something very similar with respect to the Credo. And we have every 2 years, we ask all 135,000 employees, hey, how are we living into these things? Are they meeting the needs of yourself and everything that we profess that we're trying to do? How are we measured against that? And I think that's critically important feedback for us to evaluate. Now, again, doing it every 2 years doesn't mean people can just be quiet during the time in between. And that's why I think Brandon has certainly hit the nail on the head with respect to saying, hey, speak up. People are willing to listen more than probably ever before, and listen with the intent to act.
So last question, just as we bring this to a close, and thank our audience. Thank you for joining us today and being a part of this conversation. We're delighted to have such great participation, and I wish I could see all of your faces, although I'd be overwhelmed. So probably just as well that I don't. But kind of just back to the question of philosophy, corporate purpose. Brandon, you talk about, beyond the philosophy of beyond the numbers. Can you just say a little bit about your own personal journey here and what you think is ahead? What are you leaning into? What part of this puzzle are you most interested in?
I'm most interested in how we as an organization can continue to build a sustainable business. My view is, as leaders, we've inherited something here and we have to be stewards of this business. We had a tremendous founder, David Neilman, who started with this mission of bringing humanity back to air travel. And we do much more than just take people from point A to point B. We provide a service that's at a price point that's accessible, and that has a profound impact on people's lives and their ability to connect. So as temporary stewards of this business, I want to ensure that when I and the rest of us leave, this business is in as good, if not a better place than we inherited it. And part of that is you have to adapt to the things that are happening around us. And ESG provides a framework for doing that.
Thank you. Joe, you're going to get the last word here.
Sure. Thanks, Judy. And again, it's been a real pleasure to be here with you and Brandon today. I think beyond the numbers really captures it. Certainly as a CFO, I do have an appreciation that, while numbers are important, it does enable us to live into many of the commitments to other stakeholders that are not labeled as shareholders. Understanding that it's really the science, the people behind that's technical expertise, their innovative spirit is really what drives the results. And so what excites me going forward is what type of actions can we take today that really live into the long term. Well, after I and my peers on the management team are gone, people can look back 15, 20 years from now and say, boy, they had the foresight, just like Robert Wood Johnson did back in 1943 to write a Credo. What are we going to do in that regard to say, boy, they made the company, society, and the employee workforce, they suited them up for success at that point in time with some of the decisions that we make today.
Well, Brandon, Joe, I want to thank both of you for your time with us today, giving us a little window into your extraordinary organizations. And obviously, you give me a desire to want to continue to learn about both JetBlue and J&J. And so thank you so much for being part of this today. And again, thanks to our audience, and thanks to my colleagues at the Aspen Business and Society program who have been leading this Art of the ESG conversation in different forms over the last week. We hope to see you all again in our next opportunity to engage publicly with you. And I wish you the absolute best and healthiest of holidays and year ahead. So thank you all.